Editorial note. What, for want of a better phrase, I will henceforth be referring to as the Kane Archive is, in truth, barely deserving so of a grandiloquent title. It consists merely of a single data slate, stuffed full of files arranged with a cavalier disregard for chronology and to no scheme of indexing that I have been able to determine despite prolonged examination of the contents. What can be stated with absolute certainty, however, is that the author was none other than the celebrated Commissar Caiaphas Kane, that the archive was written by him during his retirement while serving as a tutor at the School of Progemium. This would pin the date of composition to some time after his appointment to the faculty in 993 M41. From occasional references to his published memoirs, To Serve the Emperor, A Commissar's Life, which first saw the light of day in 005 M42. We can safely conclude that he was inspired by the process of writing them to embark on a fuller account on his experiences, that the bulk of the archive was composed no earlier than this. His motives for doing so we can only guess at, since publication would have been impossible. Indeed, I placed them under inquisitorial seal the moment they came to light, for reasons which should be immediately apparent to any attentive reader. Nevertheless, I believe that they are worthy for further study. Some of my fellow inquisitors may be shocked to discover that one of the Imperium's most venerated heroes was, by his own admission, a scoundrel and self-seeking rogue, a fact of which, due to our sporadic personal association, I have long been aware. Indeed, I would go so far as to contend that it was this very combination of character flaws which made him one of the most effective servants in the Imperium has ever had, despite his strenuous efforts to the contrary. For in his century or more of active service to the Commissariat, and occasionally less visible activities at my behest, he faced and bested almost every enemy of humanity: Necrons, Tau, Tyranids, and Orcs, Eldar, both free of taint and corrupted by the ruinous powers, and the demonic agents of those powers themselves. Reluctantly, it must be admitted, but in many cases, repeatedly, and always with success, a record few, if any, or more noble men can equal. In fairness, it should also be pointed out here that Kane is his own harshest critic, often going out of his way to deny that the many instances in which he appears, despite his professed baser motives, to have acted primarily out of loyalty or altruism, or any such thing. It would be ironic, indeed, if his awareness of his shortcomings should have blinded him to his own, admittedly often well-hidden virtues. It is also worth reflecting that if, as is often assured, courage consists not of the absence of fear, but the overcoming of it, Kane does indeed richly deserve his heroic reputation, even if he always steadfastly denied the fact. However, much we may deplore his professed moral shortcomings, his successes are undeniable, and we can be thankful that Kane's own account of his checkered career has at last been discovered. To say the least, these memoirs shed new light on many of the odder corners of recent imperial history, and his eyewitness accounts of our enemies contain many valuable, if idiosyncratic, insights into understanding and confounding their dark designs. It is for this reason I preserve the archive, and have spent a considerable amount of leisure time in the years since its discovery, editing and annotating it, in an attempt to make it more accessible to those of my fellow inquisitors who may wish to peruse it for themselves. Kane appears to have had no overall structure in mind, simply recording these incidents from his past as they occur to him, and, as a result, many of the anecdotes are devoid of context. He had a disconcerting habit of beginning in media res, and many of the shorter fragments end abruptly as his own part of the events he is describing come to a conclusion. I have therefore chosen to begin the process of dissemination with his account of the Gravilax campaign, which is reasonably coherent and with which the members of our Ordo will be at least passingly familiar as a result of my own involvement in the affair. Indeed, it contains an account of our first meeting from Kane's perspective, which I must admit I found rather amusing when I first stumbled across it. For the most part, the archive speaks for itself, although I have taken the liberty of breaking up the long and unstructured account into relatively self-contained chapters. To facilitate reading. The quotations preceding them are something of an indulgence on my part, having been culled from a collection of sayings compiled by Kane himself for the apparent amusement and edification of the cadets in his charge. But I justify this as perhaps providing an additional insight into the workings of his mind. Apart from this, I have confined myself to occasional editorial interpolations where I considered it necessary to place Kane's somewhat self-centered narrative into a wider context. Unless otherwise attributed, all such annotations are my own, and I have been otherwise content to let his own words do the work. Amberley Vale, Ordo Xenos. One. I don't know what effect they have on the enemy, but by the Emperor they frighten me. General Karras of the Valhallans under his command. One of the things you might learn as a commissar is that people are never pleased to see you. Something that's no longer the case where I'm concerned, of course, now that my glorious and undeserved reputation precedes me wherever I go. A good rule of thumb in my younger days, but I never found myself staring down death in the eyes of the troopers I was supposed to be inspiring with loyalty to the Emperor before. In my early years, as an occasionally loyal minion of His Glorious Majesty, I had faced, or to be more accurate, ran away screaming from, orcs, necrons, tyranids, and a severely hacked-off demon host, just to pick out some highlights of my ignominious career. But standing in that mess room, a heartbeat away from being... There's the ASMR part. I'm going to calmly flip the page. Being ripped apart by mutinous guardsmen was a unique experience, and one I have no wish to repeat. I should have realized how bad the situation was when the commanding officer of my new regiment actually smiled at me as I stepped off the shuttle. I already had every reason to fear the worst, of course, but by that time I was out of options. Paradoxical as it might seem, taking this miserable assignment had looked uncomfortably like the best chance I had of keeping my precious skin in one piece. The problem, of course, was my undeserved reputation for heroism, which by that time had grown to such a ludicrous proportion that the commissariat had finally noticed me, and decided that my talents were being wasted in the artillery unit I had picked as the safest place to set up my lifetime of service to the Emperor, a long way away from the sharp end of combat. Accordingly, I found myself plucked from the position of relative obscurity and attached directly to the brigade I found myself plucked from the position of relative obscurity and attached directly to the brigade headquarters. That hadn't seemed too bad at first, as I had little to do except shuffle data slates and organize the occasional firing squad, which had suited me fine. But the trouble with everybody thinking you're a hero is that they tend to assume you like being in mortal danger. And go out of their way to provide some. In the half-dozen years since my arrival, I'd been temporarily seconded to units assigned, among other things, to assault fixed positions, clear out a space hulk, run recon deep behind enemy lines. And every time I'd made it back alive, due in no small part to my natural talent for diving for cover and waiting for the noise to stop. The general staff had patted me on the head, given me another commendation, and tried to find an even more inventive way of getting me killed. Something obviously had to be done, and done fast, before my luck ran out altogether. So, as I often had before, I let my reputation do the work for me. Excuse me. So, as I often had before, I let my reputation do the work for me, and put in a request for a transfer back to a regiment. Any regiment. By that time, I didn't care. Long experience had taught me that the opportunities for taking care of my own neck were much higher when I could pull rank on every officer around me. I just don't think I'm cut out for data shuffling, I said apologetically to the weasel-faced little runt in the Lord General's office. He nodded judiciously and made a show of paging through my file.
Can't say I'm surprised,
he said, in a slightly nasally whine. Although he tried to look cool and composed, his body language betrayed his excitement at being in the presence of a living legend. At least that's what some damn fool pitcast commentator had called me after the siege of Perlia, and the appellation stuck. The next thing I know, my own face is grinning at me from recruiting posters all over the sector, and I couldn't even grab a mug of recap without having a piece of paper shoved under my nose with a request to autograph it.
It doesn't suit everybody.
It's a shame we can't have all your dedication to the smooth running of the Imperium, I said. He looked sharply at me for a moment, wondering if I was taking the frack, which, of course, I was, then decided I was simply being civil. I decided to ladle it on a bit. But I'm afraid I've been a soldier for too long to start changing my habits now. That was the sort of thing Kane the hero was supposed to say, of course. The Liesel face whacked it up. He took my transfer request from me as though it were a relic from one of the blessed saints.
I'll handle it personally,
he said, practically bowing as he showed me out. And so, it was a month or so later I found myself in a shuttle approaching the hangar bay of the Righteous Wrath, a battered old troop ship identical to the thousands in Imperial service, almost all of which I sometimes think I've traveled on over the years. The familiar smell of the shipboard air, stale, recycled, inexorably intertwined with rancid sweat, machine oil, and boiled cabbage, hissed into the passenger compartment as the hatch seals opened. I inhaled it gratefully as it displaced the no less familiar odor of Gunner Jurgen. I'm only going to say this a million other times after this. Jurgen is the best character. Jurgen is best boy. The familiar odor of Gunner Jurgen, my aide almost since the outset of my commissarial career nearly 20 years before. Short of our Valhallan, Jurgen somehow managed to look awkward and out of place wherever he was. And in all our time together, I couldn't recall a single occasion on which he'd ever worn anything that appeared to fit properly. Though amiable enough in temperament, he seemed ill at ease with people, and in turn most preferred to avoid his company, a tendency no doubt exacerbated by the perpetual psoriasis that affected him, as well as his body odor, which, in all honesty, took quite a while of getting used to. Nevertheless, he'd proven an able and valued aid, due in no small part to his peculiar mentality. Not overly bright, but eager to please and doggedly loyal, and doggedly literal in his approach to following orders. He'd become a useful buffer between me and some of the more onerous aspects of my job. He never questioned anything I said or did, apparently convinced that it must be for the good of the Imperium in some way, which, given the occasionally discreditable activities I've been known to indulge in, was a great deal more than I could have hoped for from any other trooper. Even after all this time, I still find myself missing him on occasion. So he was right there at my side, half hidden by our combined luggage, which he'd somehow contrived to gather up and hold despite the weight. As my boot heels first rang on the deck plating beneath the shuttle, I didn't object. Experience had taught me that it was a good idea for people meeting him for the first time to get the full picture in increments. I paused, fractionally for dramatic effect, before striding forward to meet the small knot of guard officers drawn up to greet me by the main cargo doors. The clang of my footsteps on the metal sounding crisp and authoritative as I could contrive. An effect undercut slightly by the pops and clings from the scorched area underneath the shuttle engines as it cooled, and Jorgen's tottering gait behind me. "Welcome, Commissar. This is a great honor." A surprisingly young woman with red hair and blue eyes stepped forward and snapped a crisp salute with parade ground efficiency. I thought for a moment that I was being subtly snubbed, with only the junior officers present, before I reconciled her face with the file picture in the briefing slate. I returned the salute. "Colonel Castine," I nodded in acknowledgement, despite having no objection to being fawned over by young women in the normal course of events. I found such a transparent attempt at ingratiation a little nauseating. Then I got a good look at her hopeful expression, and felt as though I'd stepped on a non-existent final stare. She was absolutely sincere. Emperor, help me! They were really pleased to see me. Things must be even worse than I imagined. Just how bad they actually were I had yet to discover, but I already had some presentiment. For one thing, the palms of my hands were tingling, which always means there's trouble hanging in the air like the static before a storm. And another, I'd broken with the habit of a lifetime, and actually read the briefing slate carefully on the tedious voyage out here to meet the ship. To cut a long story short, morale in the Valhallan 296 and 301st was at a rock bottom, and the root cause of it was obvious from the regiment's title. Combining below-strength regiments was a standard practice among the Imperial Guard, a sensible way of consolidating after combat losses to keep units up to strength, and a further use in the field. What hadn't been sensible was combining what was left of the 301st, a crack planetary assault unit, with 1,500 years of traditional belief in their innate superiority over every other unit in the Guard, particularly the other Valhallan ones. With the 296, a rear echelon garrison command which, just to throw Promethium on the flames, was one of the few all-women regiments raised and maintained by that desolate ice ball. And, just to put the cherry on it, Castine had been given overall command by virtue of 3 days' seniority over her new immediate subordinate, a man with far more combat experience. Not that any of them truly lacked that now, after the battle for Cormano. The Tyranids had attacked without warning, and every guard regiment on the planet had been forced to resist ferociously for nearly a year before the Navy and a couple of Astartes chaplains had arrived to turn the tide. And here we have our first note. 1. A common mistake. It is, of course, virtually unheard of for an entire Astartes chapter to take the field at once, let alone 2. What Kane obviously means here is that elements from 2 different chapters were involved. A couple of companies apiece, from the Reclaimers and the Swords of the Emperor. By that time, every surviving unit has sustained at least 50% casualties, many of them a great deal more, and the bureaucrats of the Minotaurium have begun the process of consolidating the battered survivors into useful units once again. On paper, at least. No one with any practical military experience would have been so half-witted as to ignore the morale effects of their decisions. But that's bureaucrats for you. Maybe if a few more administrative drones were given las guns and told to soldier along the troopers for a month or 2, it would shake up their ideas a bit. Assuming by some miracle they weren't shot in the back on the first day, of course. But I'm digressing. I returned Castine's salute, noting as I did so the faint discoloration of the fabric beneath her rank insignia, where her captain studs had been before a recent unanticipated elevation to colonel. There had been few officers left in either regiment by that time that news had gotten through to them, and they'd been lucky at that. At least one of the newly consolidated units was being led by a former corporal, or so I heard. 2. He'd heard wrong, or is possibly exaggerating for effect. The newly appointed colonel of the 112th Rough Riders was a former sergeant, true, but had already received a battlefield promotion to lieutenant during the defiance of Cormano. None of the senior command staff, if any of the recent consolidated units, had made the promotional jump directly from non-commissioned officer. Unfortunately, neither of the commissars had survived. So, thanks to my fortuitously timed transfer request, I've been handed the job of sorting out the mess. Lucky me. Major Brocklore, my second in command, Castine introduced the man next to her, his own insignia equally new. His face flushed almost imperceptibly, but he stepped forward to shake my hand with a firm grip. His eyes were flint gray beneath his dark fringe of hair, and he closed his hand a little too tightly, trying to gauge my strength. 2 could play at that game, of course, and I had the advantage of a couple augmentic fingers. I returned the favor, smiling blandly as the color drained from his face. Major? I let him go before anything was damaged, except his pride, and turned to the next officer in line. Castine had rounded up pretty much her entire senior command staff, as protocol demanded, but it was clear most of them weren't too sure about having me around. Only a few met my eyes. But the legend of Kane the Hero had arrived here before me, and the ones that did were obviously hoping I'd be able to turn around a situation they patently felt had gone way beyond their own ability to deal with. I don't know what the rest were thinking, but they were probably just relieved I wasn't talking about shooting the lot of them and bringing in somebody competent. Of course, if that had been a realistic option, I might have considered it. But I had an unwanted reputation for honesty and fairness to live up to. So that was that. The introductions over, I turned to Castine and indicated the tottering pile of kit bags behind me. Her eyes widened. Her eyes widened fractionally as she caught a glimpse of Jurgen's face behind the barricade, and I suppose anyone who'd gone hand-to-hand with Tyranids would have found the experience relatively unperturbing, as she masked it quickly. Most of the assembled officers I noted with well-concealed amusement
were now breathing shallowly through their mouths.
My aide, Gunner First Class Ferric Jurgen, I said. In truth, there was only one grade of gunner, but I didn't expect them to know that. And the small, unofficial promotion would add to whatever kudos he got from being the aide of a commissar, which, in turn, would reflect well on me.
Perhaps you could assign him some quarters.
Of course.
She turned to one of the youngest lieutenants, a blonde girl of vaguely equine appearance, who looked as if she'd be more at home on a farm somewhere, in uniform, and nodded.
Sula, get the quartermaster to sort it out.
I'll do it myself, she replied, slightly overdoing the eager young officer routine.
Maggle's doing his best, but he's not quite on top of the system yet.
Castine nodded blandly, unaware of any problems, but I could see Brocklaw's jaw tighten, and noticed that most of the men present failed to mask their displeasure.
Sula was our quartermaster sergeant until the last round of promotions, Castine explained. She knows the ship's resources better than anyone.
I'm sure she does, I said diplomatically, and I'm sure she has far more pressing duties to perform than finding a bunker for Jurgen. We'll liaise with your Sergeant Maggle ourselves, if you have no objection.
None at all.
Castine looked slightly puzzled for a moment, then dismissed it. Brocklaw, I noticed from the corner of my eye, was looking at me with something approaching respect now. Well, that was something at least. But it was pretty clear I was going to have my work cut out to turn this divided, demoralized rabble into anything resembling a fighting unit. Well, up to a point anyway. If there were a long way from being ready to fight the enemies of the Imperium, they certainly in good... excuse me. Well, up to a point anyway. If they were a long way from being ready to fight the enemies of the Emperor, they were certainly good enough shape to fight amongst themselves, as I'm shortly to discover. I haven't reached my second century by ignoring the little presentiments of trouble which sometimes appear out of nowhere, like those itching palms of mine, or the little voice in the back of my head which tells me something seems too good to be true. But on my first days aboard the Righteous Wrath, I had no need of such subtle promptings from my subconscious. Tension hung in the air of the corridors assigned to us like ozone around a demon host, but striking sparks, all but striking sparks from the bull. Oh my goodness, my voice. I'm going crazy. Tension hung in the air of the corridors assigned to us like ozone around a demon host, but striking sparks from the bulkheads. And I wasn't the only one to feel it. None of the other regiments on board would venture into our part of the ship, either for social interaction or the time-honored tradition of perpetuating practical jokes against the members of another unit. The naval provosts patrolled intense, wary groups, desperate for some kind of respite. I even made courtesy calls on the other commissars aboard, but these were far from congenial, humorless emperor botherers to a man. The younger ones were too overwhelmed by respect for a reputation to be good company, and most of the older ones were quietly resentful of what they saw as a glory-hogging young upstart. Tedious as these interludes were, though, I was to be grateful for them far sooner than I thought. More booking and some more. Turning the page. The one bright spot was Captain Parjita, who commanded the vessel for the past 30 years,
but with whom I hit it off with from our first dinner together. I'm sure he only invited me on the first time because protocol demanded it, and perhaps out of curiosity to see what an hero of the Imperium actually looked like in the flesh. But by the time we were halfway through the first course, we were chatting away like old friends. I told a few outrageous lies about my past adventures, and he reciprocated with some anecdotes of his own. And by the time we got into the Amasec, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. For one thing, he really appreciated the problems I was facing with Castine and her rabble. "You need to reassert some discipline," he told me unnecessarily, "before the rot spreads any further. Shoot a few, that'll buck their ideas up." Easy to say, of course, but not so easy in practice. That's what most commissars would have done, admittedly, but getting a regiment united because they're terrified of you and hate your guts has its own drawbacks, particularly as you're going to find yourself in the middle of a battlefield with these people before very long, and they'll all have guns. And, as I've already said, I had a reputation to maintain, and a good part of that was keeping up the pretense that I actually gave a damn about the troopers under my command. That I actually gave a damn about the troopers under my command. So, not an option. Unfortunately. It was while I was on my way back to my quarters from one such pleasant evening that my hand was forced, and in a way, I could have well done without. It was the noise that alerted me at first. A gradual swelling babble of voices in the corridors leading to our section of the ship. My pleasantly reflective mood enhanced by Parjita's Amazak, and a comfortable wind over the Regicide board evaporated in over an instant. I knew that sound all too well, and the clutter of boots on the deck behind me as a squad of provists double-timed towards the disturbance with shock batons drawn was enough to confirm it. I picked my pace to join them, falling behind the section leader. "Sounds like a riot," I said. The blank-visored head nodded. "Quite right, sir. Any idea what sparked it?" Not that it mattered. The simmering resentment among the Valhallans was almost cause enough on its own. Any excuse would have done. If he did have a clue, I never got to hear it, as we arrived at the doors of the mess hall. As we arrived at the door of the mess hall, a ceramic cup bearing the regimental crest of the 296 shattered against the helmet. "Emperor's blood!" I ducked reflexively, taking cover behind the nearest piece of furniture to assess the situation, while the provost waded in ahead of me, striking out with their shock batons at any target that presented itself. The room was a heaving mass of angry men and women punching, kicking, and flailing at one another, all semblance of discipline shot to hell. Several were down already, bleeding and screaming, being trampled on by the still active combatants, and the casualties were rising all the time. The fiercest fighting was going on in the center of the room, a small knot of brawlers clearly intent on actual murder unless someone intervened. Fine by me. That's what the provosts were here for. I hunkered down behind the overturned table, scanning the room as I voxed a situation report to Castine and watched them battle their way forward. The two fighters... My neck. Yeah. The fiercest fighting was going on in the center of the room. A small knot of brawlers... The two fighters at the center of the melee seemed evenly matched to me. A shaven-headed man, muscled like a Kanachan, who towered over a wiry young woman with short-cropped raven black hair. Whatever advantage he had in strength, she could match in agility, striking hard and leaping back out of range, reducing most of his strikes to glancing blows, which is just as well, as a clean hit from those ham-like fists would have likely stove her ribcage in. As I watched, he spun,
launching a lethal roundhouse kick to her temple. She ducked just a fraction slow and went sprawling as his foot grazed the top of her head, but twisted upright again with a knife from one of the tables in her hand. The blow came up towards his sternum, but he blocked it, opening up a livid red gash along his right arm. It was about then things really started to go wrong. The provost had made it almost halfway to the brawl I was watching, when the two sides finally realized they had an enemy in common. A young woman, blood pouring from her broken nose, was... Oh my gosh! Hello everybody! What's going on? Thank you so much for the raid. We're a bit in. If you have any questions, super feel free to ask. I'll do a bit of explain. So we are reading For the Emperor by Sandy Mitchell. It is a book taking place in the Warhammer 40k universe. And right now we are following a character known as Caiaphas Cain, who is a commissar. And what a commissar is basically a military officer who is supposed to inspire the troopers. But most of the time, commissars inspire people by putting the fear of God into them. But Caiaphas Cain is a bit different, as he has a reputation for being nice. So he has to be nice to keep his reputation going. Because he's not actually that nice. Well, he likes to say he's not nice. But he usually just does that to make sure that he's not the one getting shot at. Right now, he has accidentally walked into a riot. Because he got assigned to two guard units that had big casualties, and they were combined. And the combination of two regiments didn't go very well, and the two sides are now currently brawling. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I know there's probably going to be a lot of terms thrown around. And we'll keep on going. It was right about then that things really started to go wrong. The provost had made it almost halfway to the brawl I was watching, when the two sides finally realized they had an enemy in common. A young woman, blood pouring from a broken nose, was unceremoniously yanked away from the man whose groin she'd been aiming a kick at, and rounded on the provost, attempting to restrain her. Her elbow strike bounced harmlessly off his torso armor, but her erstwhile opponent leapt to her defense, swinging a broken plate in a short, clinical arc which impacted precisely on the neck joint where the helmet met flat. A bright crimson spurt of arterial blood sprayed the surrounding bystanders as the stricken provost dropped to his knees, trying to stem the bleeding. Emperor's bowels! I began to edge my way back towards the door to wait for the reinforcements Castine had promised. If they hadn't been before, the mob was in a killing mood now, and anyone that looked like a symbol of authority would become an obvious target. Even as I watched, both factions turned on the provost in their midst, who disappeared under a swarm of bodies. The troopers barely seemed human anymore. I'd seen Tyranids move like that in response to a perceived threat, but this was even worse. Your average Nid swarm had purpose and intelligence behind everything it did. Even though it's hard to remember that when a tidal wave of chitin is bearing down on you with every intention of reducing you to mincemeat. But it was clear that there was no intelligence working here. Just sheer brute bloodlust. Emperor, damn it. I'd seen cornate cults with more self-restraint than these supposedly disciplined guard troopers displayed in the mess hall. At least, while they were ripping the province apart, they weren't likely to notice me, so I made what progress I could towards the door, ready to take command of the reinforcements as soon as they arrived. And I would have made it, too, if the squad leader hadn't surfaced long enough to scream, "Commissar, help!" Oh, great. Every pair of eyes in the room suddenly swung in my direction. I thought I could see my reflection in every pupil, tracking me like an auspex. If you could take one more step towards that door, I told myself, you're a dead man. They'd be on me in seconds.
The only way to survive was to take them by surprise. So, I stepped forward instead, as though I had just entered the room. You, I pointed at a random trooper, get a broom. Whatever they'd been expecting me to say or do, this definitely wasn't it. The room hung, suspended in confusion, anticipation, the silence stretching on for an infinite second. No one moved. That was not a request, I said, raising my voice a little and taking another step forward. This mess hall is an absolute disgrace, and no one is leaving until it's been tidied up. My boots skidded to a slowly congealing pool of blood. You, go with him. Buckets and mops. Make sure you get enough to go around. Confusion and uncertainty began to spread, troopers flicking nervous glances at one another, and it gradually began to dawn on them the situation had gotten well out of hand, and that consequences had to be faced. The guardsmen I pointed out, 2 of them women, began to edge nervously towards the door. Got the double? I barked suddenly, with my best parade ground snap, and the designated troopers scurried out, ingrained patterns of discipline reasserting themselves. And that was enough. The thunderstorm crackle of violence dissipated from the room as though suddenly earth. After that, it was easy. Now that I asserted my authority, the rest fell into line as neat as you please. And by the time Castine arrived with another squad of Provosts in tow, I had already detailed a few more to escort the wounded and worse to the infirmary. A surprising number were able to walk, but there were still far too many stretcher cases for my liking. You did well, I hear. Castine was at my elbow, her face pale as she surveyed the damage. I shrugged, knowing from long experience that credit snowballs all the faster the less you seem to want it. Not well enough for some of these poor souls, I said. Bravest thing I ever saw, I heard from behind me, as one of the injured provosts was helped away by a couple of his shipmates. He just stood there and faced him down, the whole damn lot. His voice faded, adding another small increment to my heroic reputation, which I knew would be all around the ship by this time tomorrow. There'll have to be an investigation. Castine looked stunned, still not quite capable of taking in the full enormity of what had happened. We need to know who started, what happened, and who's to blame. Brocklor cut in from the door. It was obvious from the direction of his gaze where he had thought the responsibility should lie. Castine flushed. I had no doubt we'll discover the men responsible, she said, a faint but perceptible stress in the pronoun. Brocklor refused to rise to the bait. We can all thank the Emperor we have an impartial educator in the Commissar here, he said smoothly. I'm sure we can rely on him to sort it out. Thanks a lot, I thought, but he was right. And how I handled it was to determine the rest of my future with the regiment. Not to mention leaving me running for my life yet again, beginning a long and unwelcome association with the Emperor's pet psychopaths, an encounter with the most fascinating woman I had ever met. 3. Not the most flattering or accurate description of His Divine Majesty's Most Holy Inquisition, but it must be edited. Basically, these stories are... Kane had written these stories but unfortunately, they had a lot of inquisitorial sensitive information, so an inquisitor known as Amberly Vale gathered them up and divided them into chapters, and occasionally she will break in with little editorial notes. So that's what that was. Chapter 2. You get more with a kind word, or an excruciator. You get more with a kind word and an excruciator than just with a kind word. Inquisitor Mulden. So what you're trying to tell me, I said, turning the piece of crockery over in my hand, is that 3 people are dead, 14 still in the infirmary, and a perfectly servable mess hall reduced to kindlings because your men didn't like the plates they were served their meal on. Brocklor squirmed visibly on the chairs. I had Jurgen bring into my office for the conference. I told him to fetch the most uncomfortable ones he could find, as every little bit helps when you're trying to exert your authority. But the Major's discomfiture wasn't due to just that alone. Castine was still visibly suppressing a smirk. So both of the regiments that were on here, one was entirely made up of women, and the other were entirely made up of men. Castine was still visibly suppressing a smirk, which I had planned to wipe away in a moment. Well, that may be overstating it a little, he began. That's precisely what happened, Castine cut in acidically. I hefted the plate. It was a good quality porcelain. Delicate but strong, and one of the few pieces remaining intact after the mess hall riot. The regimental cast of the 296 was prominent in the center of it. I turned the data slate on my desk and made a show of paging through the reports and witness statements I'd spent the past week collecting. According to this witness statement, the first punch was swung by a Corporal Bella Trebek, a member of the 296, prior to the amalgamation. I raised an inquisitive eyebrow in Castine's direction. Would the Colonel care to comment? She was clearly provoked, Castine said, losing the smirk, which seemed to hover in the air for a moment before jumping to Brocklor. Just so, I noticed judiciously, by a Sergeant Tobias Kelp, who, it says here, threw his plate down, declaring that he would be damned if he ate off some... I made a show of getting the quotations scripturally correct. Mincing Tart's front parlor tea service. Does that strike you as a reasonable comment, Major? The smirk disappeared again. Not particularly so, he said, clearly wondering where this line of questioning was going. But we still don't know the full consequences. But we clearly don't know the full circumstances. I think the circumstances are perfectly clear, I said. The former troopers of the 296 and the 301st have cordially detested one another since the regiments were amalgamated. Under the circumstances, the use of 296 regimental dinner service was bound to be regarded as an insult by the stupider elements of the former 301st. Brockler flushed at that. Good. Let him get angry. The only good way to salvage the situation was to make radical changes, and that wouldn't work unless I could get the senior officers to feel passionately that they were necessary. Which begs another question, I went on smoothly. Just who was stupid enough to order the use of the dinner service in the first place? I aimed my second best intimidating commissarial glare at Castine for a fraction of a second before snapping it back to round the nail, the junior officer sitting at her right. Lieutenant Sula, that would be you, would it not? It was Founding Day, she retorted. That did take me by surprise. I didn't often get people bouncing back from a number 2 glare, but I concealed it with the ease of long practice. We always use the regimental ceramics on Founding Day. It's one of our proudest traditions. It was, Brockler broke in with sardonic amusement. But unless you've got some traditional adhesive... Both women bristled. For a moment I thought I was going to have to put down a brawl in my own office. Major, I said, asserting my authority. I'm sure that the 301st had their own Founding Day traditions. That was a pretty safe bet, as practically every regiment celebrated the anniversary of its first founding in some way. He began to nod, with my use of the past tense registered with him,
and then an expression curiously close to apprehension flickered across his face. I leaned back in my chair, which, unlike theirs, I made sure was comfortably padded and looked approvingly. It's always good to keep people off balance. I'm glad to hear it. Such traditions are important, a vital part of the esprit de corps, as we all rely on to win the Emperor's victories. Castine and Brocklor nodded cautiously, almost together. Good. That was one thing at least they could agree on, but Sula flushed angrily. Then perhaps you'd like to explain that to Kelp and his knuckle-draggers, she said. I sighed tolerantly and placed my las pistol on my desk. The officer's eyes widened slightly. Brocklor's took on a wary expression, Castine's one of barely suppressed alarm, and Sula's jaw dropped open. Please don't interrupt, Lieutenant, I said mildly. You can all have your way in a moment. There was a definite edge in the room now. I had no intention of shooting anyone, of course, but they weren't going to like what I was about to say next. And you can't be too careful. I smiled to show that I was harmless, and they relaxed a fraction. Nevertheless, you've illustrated my point perfectly. While the two halves of this regiment still think themselves as separate units, morale is never going to recover. That means you're sort all use to the Emperor and a pain in the arse to me. I paused just long enough to let them assimilate what I had just said. Are we in agreement on that, at least? Castine nodded, meeting Brocklor's eyes for the first time since the meeting began. I think so, she said. The question is, what do we do about it? Good question. I passed a slate across the desk. She took it, and Brocklor leaned in to scan it over her shoulder as she read. We can start by integrating the units at the squad level. As of this morning, every squad will consist of roughly equal numbers of troopers from each of the former regiments. That's ridiculous! Brocklor snapped, a fraction behind Castine's far from ladylike exclamation. The men won't stand for it. Neither will my women. Castine nodded in agreement with him. So far, so good. Making them feel like they had common cause against me was the first step to getting them to cooperate properly. They're going to have to, I said. This ship is en route to a potential war zone. We could be in combat within hours of our arrival, and when that happens, they'll have to rely on the trooper next to them, whoever it is. I don't want my people getting killed because they don't trust their own comrades, so they're going to train together and work together until they're behaving like an Imperial Guard regiment instead of a bunch of pre-scholar juvies. And then they're going to fight the Emperor's enemies together, and I expect them to win. Is that clear? Perfectly, Commissar. Castine's jaw was tight. I'll start reviewing some of the SO&E. 4. Slate of organization and equipment. Not exactly a physical data slate, but an archaic form for the details of disposition of troopers and equipment within the Imperial Guard unit. Still in use among many regiments, with more than 1,000 years of unbroken tradition. Perhaps it would be best if you did so with the Major's help, I suggested. Between you, you should be able to select fire teams which at least have a reasonable chance of turning their lasguns on the enemy instead of each other. Of course, Brocklor nodded. I'll be pleased to help. The tone of his voice said otherwise, but at least the words were conciliatory. That was a start, but they really weren't going to like what was coming next. Which brings me to the new regimental designation. I expected some outburst at this, but the trio of officers in front of me just stared in stupefied silence. I guess they were trying to convince themselves they hadn't heard what I just said.
The current one just emphasizes the divisions between what used to be the 301st and the 296th. We need a new one, ladies and gentlemen. A single identity under which we can march into battle united and resolute as true servants of the Emperor. All good stirring stuff. And for a moment I actually thought they were going to buy it without any further argument. But of course, that daft mare Sula had to burst the bubble. You can't just abolish the 296, Gemma shouted. Our battle honors go back centuries. You count slapping down sloppy Cornelis' battles. Buckler rose to the bait. The 301st fought orcs, Eldar, Tyranids. Oh, were there Tyranids on Corania? I guess I was just too busy with my needle-pointed notice. Sula's voice rose another octave. Shut up, both of you! Castine's voice was quiet but firm, and stunned both of her subordinates into silence. I nodded gratefully at her, forestalled from having to do the job myself, and was pleasantly surprised. It was beginning to look as though she had the markings of an effective commander after all. Let's hear what the Commissar has to say before we start inventing objections to it. Thank you, Colonel, I said before resuming. What I propose is to treat the date of amalgamation as a new first founding, as I've had the ship Astropath contact the Munitorium, and they've agreed in principle. There is currently no regiment designated the Valhallan 597. So I proposed adopting that as our new identity. 296 plus 301. I see. Castine nodded. Very clever. Rocklore nodded too. A very neat way of preserving the identities of the old regiments, but combined into something new. As was always the intention, I agreed. But that's outrageous! You can't just redesignate an entire regiment out of existence. The Commissariat gives its servants wide discretionary powers, I said mildly. How we interpret them is a matter of judgment, and sometimes temperament. Not every commissar would have resisted the temptation to discourage further dissension in the ranks by decimation, for instance. Quite true, of course. There were a damn few who'd go quite as far as to randomly execute 1 out of 10 troopers under his command to encourage the others. But they did exist. And if ever a regiment who was so undisciplined that such a drastic measure might have been justified, it was this one, and they knew it. They were just lucky they got Kane the hero instead of some gung-ho psychopath. I've met one or two in my time, and the best thing you can say for them is that they don't tend to be around for long, particularly once the shooting starts. I smiled to show I didn't mean it. If the designation is unacceptable, I added, the 45th Penal Legion is also available, I'm told. Sula blenched. Castine smiled tightly, unsure of how serious I was. The 597 sounds good to me, she said. Major Brockler? An excellent compromise, he nodded slowly, letting the idea percolate. There'll be some gobblings in the ranks, but if ever a regiment needed a new beginning, it's this one. Amen to that, Castine agreed. The two senior officers looked at one another with renewed respect. That was a good sign, too. Only Sula looked a little... Cormano Bungus! How could this... I am CormanoTheMage. Oh, worst reading. Where was I? Only Sula looked unhappy, Rocklord noticed, and caught her eye. Cheer up, Lieutenant, he said. That will make our next founding day. He paused fractionally, glancing at me for confirmation as he worked it out. 258. I nodded. You'll have nearly 8 months to come with some brand new traditions. Of course, the changes I imposed didn't go down too well within the rank and file. at least to begin with, and I got most of the blame. But then, I never expected to be popular. Ever since I got selected for commissarial training, I've known that I could expect very little from the troopers around me, apart from resentment and suspicion. As my undeserved reputation has snowballed, of course, that's gotten to be the case less and less at the time. But back then, I was taking it more or less for granted. Gradually, though, the reorganization I insisted on began to work, and the training exercises we put the troopers through were beginning to make them think like soldiers again. I instituted a weekly prize of an afternoon's downtime for the most efficient platoon in the regiment, and a doubling of the ale rations for the members of the most disciplined squad within it. And that helped remarkably. I feel we really turned a corner in the morning. I overheard one of the new mixed squads chatting together in a freshly repainted mess hall. Instead of splitting into two separate groups, I have completely lost my page. Instead of splitting into two separate groups, as they intended to do in the beginning, and exulted over their higher place in the rankings than a rival platoon. These days, I'm told Kane's Round is a cherished tradition in the 597, and the competition for the extra ration of ale is hotly contested. All in all, I suppose there are worse things to be remembered for. The one problem we still had to resolve, of course, was the matter of those responsible for the riots in the first place. Kelp and Trebek were for it, and there were no doubt about that, along with a handful of others who had been positively identified as responsible for the worst of the deaths and injuries. But for the time being, I put off the question of punishment. The wholesale reforms I'd instigated and the subsequent improvement in morale were still fragile, and I didn't dare risk it by ordering execution. So I did what any sensible man in my position would have done. Dragged my feet under the pretext of carrying out a thorough investigation, keeping the defaulters locked away where, with any luck, most of their comrades would forget about them in the general upheaval, and hoped something would turn up. It was a good plan, and it would have worked too, at least until we arrived into a war zone, somewhere where I could quietly return them to a unit or have them transferred away with no one any the wiser. If it hadn't been for my good friend, Captain Parjita. Technically, of course, he was well within his rights to demand copies of all the reports I'd been compiling, and I hadn't thought there was any harm in letting him have them. What I'd been forgetting was that the Righteous Wrath wasn't a collection of corridors, bunk rooms, and training bays. It was his ship, and he was the ultimate authority aboard. 2 of the dead had been his provosts, after all, and he wasn't about to sit back and let the perpetrators get away with it. He wanted a full court-martial of the guilty troopers while we were still on board, and he could make sure they were punished to his satisfaction. "I know you wanted to be thorough," he said one evening, as we set up the regicide board in his quarters. "But frankly, Caiaphas, I think you're overdoing it. You already know who the guilty parties are. Just shoot them and get it over with." I shook my head regretfully. "But what would that solve?" I asked. "Would that bring your men back to life?" "That's not the point." He held out both fists, concealing playing pieces. I picked the left and found I was playing blue. A minor tactical disadvantage, but one I was sure I could overcome. Regicide isn't really my game, to be honest. Give me a tarot deck and a table full of suckers with more money than sense any day. But I passed the time pleasantly enough. There really can't be any other verdict. And every day you delay just leaves the cowardly scum cluttering up my brig, eating my food, breathing my air. He was getting quite emotional,
I began to suspect that there had been more than a simple line of command relationship between him and one of the dead provosts. 5. Kane is correct in this assumption. Strictly against regulations, of course, but boys will be boys. Believe me, I said, there's nothing I'd like better than to draw a line under this whole sorry affair. The situation's complicated. If I had them shot, the whole regiment could unravel again. Morale is just starting to recover. I appreciate that, Pajita nodded. That's not my problem. I've got a crew to think about, and they want to see their comrades avenged. He made his opening move. I see. I moved one of my own pieces, playing for time in more senses than one. Then it's clearly long past that time justice was served. Are you insane? Castine said, looking at me across the desk and trying to ignore the hovering presence of Jurgen, who was shuffling some routine reports I couldn't be bothered to deal with. If you condemn the revolters now, we'll be right back where we started. Trebek's very popular with the... She shot a quick glance at Brocklor seated next to her, and overrode the remark she'd been about to make. With some of the troopers. How goes the same for Kelp? Brocklor moved quickly to back her up. Exactly the reaction I'd been hoping for. Now the regiment was beginning to function properly. Castine and Brocklor had begun to slip into their roles of commander and executive officer as smoothly as if the bad feeling between them had never existed. Well, up to a point anyway. There was still an air of strained politeness between them occasionally, which betrayed the effort, but they were well on the way. And to be honest, it was far more than I ever could have hoped for when I stepped off the shuttle. I agree, I said. Thank you, Jurgen. My aide had appeared at my shoulder with a pot of tanna-leaf tea, as was his habit whenever I was in my office at this time in the morning. Jurgen is definitely one of the best characters, so watch out for him. Could you get another couple of bowls? Of course, Commissar. He shuffled away as I poured my own drink and pushed the tray to the side of my desk. The warm, aromatic steam relaxed me as it always did. Not for me, thank you, Brocklor said, hastily as Jurgen returned a fresh pair of tea bowls pinched together by a grubby finger and thumb on the inside of the rims. Castine blenched slightly, but accepted a drink anyway. She kept it on the desk in front of her, picking it up from time to punctuate her side of the conversation, but never quite getting around to taking the first sip. I was quietly impressed. She'd have made a good diplomat if she hadn't been so honest.
Excuse me, I wanted to do a little adjustment. The problem is, I went on, that Captain Parjita is the ultimate authority aboard this ship, and he's well within his rights to insist on a court-martial. If we don't let him have one, he'll just invoke his command privilege and have Kelp and the others shot anyways. And we simply can't let that happen. So what do you suggest? Castine asked, replacing the tea bowl after another almost sip. Regimental discipline is supposed to be your responsibility after all. Precisely. I took a sip of my own tea, savoring the bitter aftertaste, and nodded judiciously. And I've been able to convince him that I can't have that authority undermined if we're to become a viable fighting unit. You've got him to agree to some kind of compromise? Brocklor asked, grasping the pointed points. I have. I try not to sound too smart. He can have his court-martial and run it himself under naval regulations. But once they're found guilty, they'll be turned over to the commissariat for sentencing. But that takes us right back to where we were before, Castine said, clearly puzzled. You have them shot, and discipline goes to the warp again. Maybe not, I said, taking another sip of tea. Not if we're careful. I've seen more than my share of tribunals over the years, and even been in front of them on occasion. And if there's one thing I've learned at this, it's easy to get the result you want out of them. The trick is simply to state your case as clearly and concisely as possible. That, and making damn sure the members of it are on your side to begin with. There are a number of ways of ensuring that this is the case. Bribery and threats are always popular, but generally to be avoided, especially if you're likely to attract inquisitorial attention, as they're better at both and tend to present other people resorting to their methods. 6. This is, of course, entirely untrue, as His Divine Majesty's most faithful servants were most definitely above such petty emotions as resentment.
Meaning that they are definitely better at bribery and threatening.
Besides, that sort of thing tends to leave a residue of bad feeling, which can come back to haunt you later on. In my experience, it's far more effective to make sure that the other members of the panel are honest, unimaginative idiots with a strong sense of duty and a stronger sense of prejudices you can rely on to deliver the result you want. And if they think you're a hero and hang on your every word, so much the better. So when Parjita announced his verdict of guilty on all charges and turned to me with a self-satisfied smirk, I had my strategy worked out well in advance. The courtroom, a hastily converted wardroom? I don't know what a wardroom is. Wardroom, generally used by the ship's most junior officers, went silent. There were 5 troopers in the dock at that time the trial had begun. Far fewer than Parjita had wanted, but in the interest of fairness and damage, the limitation I had managed to persuade him to let me deal summarily with the most of the outstanding cases. Those guilty of more minor offenses would have been demoted, flogged, or assigned latrine duty for the foreseeable future, and safely returned to their units. Where, in the unfathomable processes of the trooper's mindset, I had somehow become the embodiment of justice and mercy. This had been helped along by a little judicious myth-making among the senior officers, who had let it be known that Parjita was hell-bent on mass executions, and I had spent the past few weeks exerting every iota of my commissarial authority and urging clemency for the vast majority, finally succeeding against almost impossible odds. The net result, aided no end by my fictitious reputation, that with a couple of dozen potential troublemakers had been quietly integrated back into the roster. Practically grateful for the punishments they received, the morale had remained steady among the rank and file. The problem now facing me was of the hardcore recidivists, who were undoubtedly guilty of murder or its attempt. There were 5 of them facing the courtroom now, wary and resentful. 3 of them I recognized at once from in the melee at the mess hall. Kelp was the huge, over-muscled man I had seen being stabbed, and Trebek, to my complete lack of surprise, was the petite woman who had almost disemboweled him. They stood on opposite ends of the row of prisoners, glaring at one another almost as much as Parjita and myself. And if it hadn't been for their manacles, I have no doubt they'd be at one another's throats again in a heartbeat. Oh man, we have been going for an hour and a half. That's what happens when you get a good book going. In the center was the younger trooper I'd seen stab the provost with a broken plate. His dataphile told me his name was Tomas Hollenby, and I had to look twice to make sure it was the same man. He was short and skinny, with untidy red hair and a face full of freckles, and he'd spent most of the trial looking bewildered and on the verge of tears. If I hadn't seen his fit of homicidal rage for myself, I would have hardly believed him capable of such an insatiate violence. The real irony was that he was the medical orderly, not a frontline soldier at all. Between him and Trebek was another female trooper, one Griselda Belade. She was a stocky brunette and clearly out of her depth as well. The only one of the group to have killed a fellow trooper, she had claimed throughout that she had only intended to fend him off. It was an unlucky blow that had crushed the fellow's larynx and left him to suffocate on the mess room floor. Arjita, needless to say, hadn't bought it, or cared whether she intended to murder or not. He just wanted as many Valhallans in the front of a firing squad as he could manage. On Hollandby's other side was Maxim Sorrel, a tall, rangy man with short blonde hair and the cold eyes of a killer. Sorrel was a sharpshooter, a long-last specialist, who snuffed out lies from a distance as dispassionately as I might swat an insect. Of all of them, he was the one who most was scared of me. The others had been carried away by the bloodlust of a mob, and hadn't really been responsible for their actions past a certain point. But Sorrel had slid a knife through the joint of a provost's body armor, simply because he hadn't seen any reason not to. The last time I looked into eyes like those, they belonged to an Eldar homunculus. "If it were up to me," Ajita said, continuing, "it would have been the lot of you shot at once." I glanced down at the line of prisoners again, and noted their reactions. Kelp and Trebek glared defiantly back at him, daring him to make good on the threat. Hollandby blinked and swallowed rapidly. Belade? That's a weird name. I'll say Belade. Belade gasped audibly, biting her lower lip, and began to hyperventilate. To my surprise, Hollandby reached across to give her hand a reassuring squeeze. Then again, they'd been in adjoining cells for 2 weeks now, so I suppose they had time to get to know each other. Sorrel simply blinked, a complete lack of emotional response that sent shivers down my spine. "Nevertheless," the captain went on, "Commissar Kane has been able to persuade me that the commissariat is better suited to maintaining discipline among the Imperial Guard, and has requested that they be permitted to pass sentence according to military rather than naval regulations." He nodded cordially to me. "Commissar, they're all yours." "Thank you, Captain." I turned to the trio of black uniformed figures sitting at my side. "And thank you, Commissars. Your advice in this case has been invaluable to me." 3 solemn heads nodded in my direction. This was the trick, you see. My earlier contact with the other commissars on board had unexpectedly paid off, showing me who would be the most easily swayed by my arguments. A couple of eager young pups just past cadet, and a jaded old campaigner who had lived most of his life on the battlefield. To all of them, flattered from here to Terra to be taken into the confidence of the celebrated Caiaphas Kane. I turned back to the prisoners. "A commissar's duty is often harsh," I said. "Regulations are there to be obeyed, and discipline to be enforced. And those regulations do indeed prescribe the ultimate penalty for murder. Unless there are extenuating circumstances. Circumstances, I have to admit, have been striven to find in this case to the best of my abilities. I had them all on the hook now. The fans and the ceiling ducts sounded almost as loud as a Chimera engine. That's a tank. Well, kind of a tank. It's a really fast tank.
and to my great disappointment, I have been unsuccessful. There was an audible intake of breath from practically every pair of lungs present. Archita grinned triumphantly. Sure, he'd get the blood vengeance he lusted after. However, I went on after a fractional pause, a faint frown appearing on the captain's face and a flicker of hope on Velida's. As my esteemed colleagues will undoubtedly agree, one of the heaviest burdens a commissar must carry is the responsibility to ensure that the regulations are obeyed not only to the letter, but the spirit. And with that in mind, I took the liberty of consulting with them about a possible interpretation of those regulations, which I felt might offer a solution to my dilemma. I turned dramatically to the little group of commissars, taking the opportunity to underline that it wasn't just me cheating Parjita out of his firing squad, it was the commissariat himself. Again, gentlemen, I thank you, not only on my behalf, but on the behalf of the regiment I have the honor to serve with. I turned to Castine and Brocklord, who were observing proceedings from the side of the courtroom, and inclined my head to them too. And I was laying it on with a trowel. I don't mind admitting it, but I've always enjoyed being the center of attention when that doesn't involve uncovered fire. A commissar's primary concern must always be the efficiency of the unit to which he is attached, I said, and by extension the battlefield effectiveness of the entire Imperial Guard. It's a heavy responsibility, but one we are proud to bear in the Emperor's name. The Emperor Commissars nodded in sycophantic self-congratulation. And that means I am always loath to sacrifice the life of a trained soldier, whatever the circumstances, unless it's the only way to win His glorious Majesty the victory he requires. I assume you're eventually going to come to a point of some kind, Parjita interrupted. I nodded as though he'd done me a favor instead of disrupting the flow of an oration I've been practicing in front of a mirror in my stateroom for most of the morning. Indeed I am, I said. And the point is this. My colleagues and I, no harm in reminding everyone again that this was carefully contrived consensus, not just me, see no point in simply executing these troopers. Their deaths will result in no victories. But the regulations, Parjita began. This time it was my turn to cut him off in full flow. They specify death as the punishment for these officers. It just doesn't specify immediate death. I turned to the line of confused and apprehensive prisoners. It is the judgment of the commissariat that you all be confined until it becomes expedient to transfer you to a penal legion, where an honorable death on the battlefield will almost certainly befall you in fullness of time. In the interim, should a particularly hazardous assignment become available, you will have the honor of volunteering. In either case, you can expect the opportunity to redeem yourselves in the eyes of the Emperor. I raked my eyes along the shabby little group again. Kelp and Trebek, their truculent, mitigated by surprise. Hollenby was still bewildered by the sudden turn of events. Velidae almost sobbing with the relief, and Sorrel. Still that plain expression, although none of this mattered at all. Dismissed! I waited until they shuffled out, assisted by the shock batons of the escorting provosts, and turned back to Parjita. Will that satisfy you, Captain? I suppose it'll have to, he said sourly. Congratulations, Commissar! Castine raised a glass of Amasec, toasting my victory, and the mess hall erupted around me. I smiled modestly, walking towards the table occupied by senior officers, while men and women clapped and cheered and chanted my name, and generally carried on as though I was the Emperor himself dropping by a visit. I half expected some of them to try patting me on the back, but respect for my position, or an understandable reluctance to get too close to Jurgen, who was dogging at my heels as usual, or both, held them at check. Another thing I forgot to mention about Jurgen, he is Commissar Kane's valiant aide, with him wherever he goes. He also smells extremely bad. The only reason Kane can tolerate it is he's been around Jurgen so much. But the smell is a perfect defense from annoying people. I held up my hands for silence as I reached my seat between Castine and Brocklor, and the room gradually fell quiet. "Thank you all," I said, injecting the right level of barely perceptible quaver into my voice to suggest powerful emotion held narrowly in check. "You do me much honor for just doing my job." A chorus of denial and adulation followed, as I known it would. I waved them to silence again. "Well, if you insist." I waited for the gale of laughter to die down. While I have everyone's attention, and that's professionally novelty for a political officer, more laughter, I had them in the palm of my hand now. I waved them to silence again, adopting a slightly more serious mind. "I would just like to offer some congratulations of my own. In the short time I've had the privilege of serving with this regiment, you have all far exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The past few weeks have been difficult for all of us, but I can state with confidence that I have never served with a body of troops more ready for combat, and with more capable of seizing victory when the time comes." With confidence, certainly. And truthfully, that was another matter entirely, but it had the desired effect. I picked up a glass from the table and toasted the room. "To the 597th! A glorious beginning! To the 597th! They all shouted. Men and women alike swept along with cheap emotion and cheaper rhetoric. "Nicely done, Commissar," Brocklor murmured as I sat. The cheers were still deafening. "I believe you've turned us into a proper regiment at last." "I've done something a lot more important than that, of course. I'd established myself as a popular figure among the common troopers, which meant they'd watch my back if ever I was careless enough to find myself anywhere near the actual combat. Pulling them together into an effective fighting force was just a useful bonus. "Just doing my job," I said modestly as I could, which is what they all expected, of course, and they lapped it up. "And not before time," Castine added. I kept my features carefully composed, but felt my good mood beginning to evaporate. "We've had our orders?" Brocklor asked. The colonel nodded, picking up her Advent salad. "Some backwater called Gravelax." "Never heard of it," I said. Alright. So with that, our first little arc has concluded. We're gonna stop for the evening. So that was the first two chapters of For the Emperor by Sandy Mitchell. If anyone does have some suggestions for books that want to be read, feel free to find and DM me on Twitter at CormanoTheMage. I think it'd be fun, and I will definitely need suggestions when I, one, run out of Warhammer books, and two, Twitch tells me to stop reading books, and I'll have to fall under reading fanfiction. But I really want to thank everyone for coming by. Thank you so much, Meow, Chief, for the raid, and for the follow. Thank you, Toby, for the follow. Thank Katoon for the follow. This has been really fun. I still do occasionally. I read to my friends over Discord. And I really wanted to incorporate that in like a stream. I definitely have to get some more practice in and have some water next to me next time. My voice is a bit shot. But for now, while we wrap everything up, let's go ahead and see if we want to raid anybody. I should probably pull up the dashboard on my Chromebook that's next to me instead of using my phone all the time. It's fine, it's fine. Alrighty. Let's see, who's going right now? Who wants to get Cormano raided? Got Hades Heavenly. They were playing Vampire Survivors a couple hours ago, and I was glued to the screen. So we'll go ahead and raid them. Again, thank you so much for coming by. As I start up a new job here, I will have a schedule, and I'll be able to figure out the next time we're able to do this. And I hope you all join me again. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful evening as we wait for the raid to go through. Alright, bye.